Thank you for the warm introductions. Again, my name is Nikki Batista. I'm the Vice President of Digital Health Regulatory Affairs at MCRA. Very briefly, MCRA is a global clinical research organization and integrated advisory firm. We specialize in the medtech space, and we lead collectively with my colleague here, Alex, the digital health program navigating and helping companies developing software in and software as medical device, bring them to market. So I'll pass it to Rebecca to introduce herself.
Yeah, so I'm VP of Clinical Research and Head of Regulatory at Imagen Technologies. At Imagen, we are providing diagnostics as a service. So what that means is we are providing both imaging equipment as well as interpretation to primary care offices. As part of our services, we have proprietary AI embedded into our platform. So we have 4 FDA clearances to date. They are AI-enabled software as a medical device, specifically in the radiology and X-ray space. And so what that software is doing is helping to support physicians as they are interpreting medical images. And I'm very happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Cadotte. I'm the Senior Director for Imaging and Digital Health at MCRA. I basically was at FDA when digital health was kind of getting kicked off, working for the digital health program. So worked on a lot of AI machine learning policy, and Nikki already kind of introduced MCRA, and I'm really excited to bring what I've learned at FDA and help people in their medical device journey.
So what we say often is good regulatory strategy is good business strategy. And so it's a key element to business success. So what we'd like to do is take a few moments at the end of the third day here to talk about the evolving regulatory policies coming out through the FDA to help you all figure out what's applicable and how to effectively navigate it. And we'd like to focus specifically on AI and ML. So often FDA is seen as a barrier to entry to market, and inherently the regulatory process and policy is reactive. As a speaker yesterday noted that we don't know how to regulate things we don't yet understand, which is a completely true statement. And so what that effectively does is impacts the timeliness of innovation hitting the patients. And so the one mechanism FDA does have is issuing guidance documents. Guidance documents outline FDA's current thinking on various policies and paradigms. And in the 5.5 years I personally worked at the FDA, I wrote one guidance document and it took me 3 years to put through. And in the last 3 years alone, the Digital Health Center of Excellence has championed a slew of policies that directly impact this ecosystem. And what's really important is to be educated on these policies so that you can figure out what's applicable to you and how to effectively use them to your business advantage. One of the really landmark policies is the Predetermined Change Control Plan policy, or PCCP. And this is FDA's, let's call it Pre-Cert 2.0 if you're familiar with the term, where FDA is reimagining how to regulate software in the long term. Prior to wanting to change algorithms, you'd have to go back to the FDA every time with a new submission. And what the PCCP guidance permits is a pre-authorization of pre-planned changes to your algorithm. For example, if you wanted to fine-tune your hyperparameters to your machine learning model, then you'd have to go back to the agency to prove that performance improvement. And effectively, this policy permits you to get that pre-authorized so that as long as you follow the plan you set forth, FDA would not expect to see a submission. So with that, I want to ask Rebecca, what does the PCCP policy mean for software development and algorithm changes for companies like Imagen?
Yeah, I think we were ecstatic to see this guidance. It really reflects the fact that the FDA is seeing that we cannot leave our AI model static, and that we have to have the flexibility where we see post-market how our algorithms are actually working. And this gives us the opportunity to be flexible, to update things based on what we're seeing. And so I think it's really exciting.
And so would you say that this is a great opportunity for companies to leverage real-world evidence?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what it enables us to do is kind of in the wild, see how the algorithm is working, and it really emphasizes that the FDA wants companies to look at that post-market data and incorporate it into their algorithms to update them, and so that we're constantly refining what we're putting out there.
And so, Alex, what does this mean to companies as they strategically plan to navigate the agency?
So I think probably one of the first things to understand is whether the guidance applies to you or not. I mean, obviously you have to be a regulated medical device, and there are changes that you can currently make without a PCCP. So there's a very specific window of changes that this would apply to. So with the guidance coming out, one of the things that you have to weigh is, for everything that you do with FDA, there's a trade-off. So there's burden related to putting together a PCCP. So, I wouldn't recommend necessarily to someone just to put a PCCP together just because they want to have one as part of their device. I mean, you should have a long-term strategy where you would be using that PCCP perhaps over multiple iterations of your device, or maybe across your spectrum of devices that you offer. Also, just kind of realize that, this is pretty new to the agency just in general. So the type of experiences you'll have interacting with them can be pretty dependent on their knowledge of the review process and experience with it as well. So just have realistic expectations for those interactions.
And so with new policies like the PCCP guidance, what it effectively does from an operational standpoint at the FDA is shift the review paradigms that the regulators have to abide by. And what you'll read in draft guidance and final guidance is a grace period, a transition for both review staff at the agency to operationalize the policy set forth and the expectations, but also allow industry the opportunity to understand what they need to abide by. So Alex, given your experience working at FDA and implementing new policies, what type of advice would you give to companies to effectively collaborate with the agency?
So, first thing first, probably just make sure that you've read recent guidance that applies. Also, make sure that your communication, not only in your written, but also your verbal communication with the agency is good, because I tend to believe that 90% of the problems with working with FDA in general are communication. So if you can't get past the communication hurdle, you're not going to get to the scientific problem. So those are probably some of the most important kind of baseline things to consider.
Right, and so like implementing policy on the industry side from Imagen's perspective, introducing innovative cutting-edge technology to the agency obviously comes with its challenges. What has been Imagen's experience with effectively navigating FDA with new technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2018, we had a de novo, which kind of paved the way for in the kind of AI radiology software as a medical device space, and that it was challenging, but I think that the advice I would give is around frequent communication with the FDA. So really utilizing the Q submission process and making sure that the FDA kind of is with you step by step in terms of your pre-market testing, your data sets, your software output. I think that that's really key to kind of have their buy-in consistently as you go along.
Yeah, and I think it's really important from a strategy perspective for early stage companies to be viewing the pre-submission process as an early win, to both communicate internally to your team and to stakeholders that will provide some transparency to the process and expectations, which can really be used as a business strategic mechanism. So Alex, with a lot of digital health policy coming through the pipe with FDA, how might this impact our companies' business strategies? So what types of questions are you getting asked commonly as a consultant?
Well, probably one of the first things is, am I regulated? There's a lot of resources out there, such as 513G, Q subs, breakthrough, kind of referring back to communicating with the agency. But also there's a lot of tools out there like the Digital Health Policy Navigator, which I really like just because it combines a lot of guidances into kind of I like to say a choose your own adventure book of FDA. It's basically an interactive website that kind of helps you figure out where do you stand relative to what FDA is interested in.
Awesome. So I want to shift gears a second and talk about data. So we've talked a lot about data throughout this program, and I think it's readily acknowledged as one of the biggest hurdles for companies developing software as a medical device, both in acquiring it, handling it, truthing it, making sure it gets you across the regulatory finish line. So to the audience, I encourage everyone to go back to that PCCP guidance, whether or not you plan to use it. There's a half page of content talking about how FDA expects you to handle data. It kind of slipped under the radar, so I encourage you all to read that and be well acquainted with the terminology. So again, you can effectively communicate with FDA. So speaking on the terms of data, Rebecca, how does Imagen go through, what frameworks do you use to procure data?
Yeah, so I'd say we spend a lot of time thinking about the data sets, both for training our AI algorithms as well as evaluating them. And we're thinking about patient demographics, we're thinking about the prevalence of the disease state of interest. We are being thoughtful about representation across the United States. And then we're also, over time, kind of really building out a robust quality system. So ensuring that training team and data set is, absolutely quarantined away from, the data set and the team that's working on the evaluation.
And Alex, what type of advice would you give to clients to make sure that their data sets are getting them across that goalpost?
So I think a great starting place is the 10 Guiding Principles document that FDA put out with Health Canada and the UK health system. Basically, it lists some of the things that that Rebecca was just discussing, and kind of sets the baseline for what FDA expects. One of the problems out there right now is that there's not a lot of specific guidances, with PCC being kind of an exception to that, but also there's not a lot of standards out there right now. So the 10 Guiding Principles document is a really great place to start if you're not familiar with working in this space.
So really leveraging FDA's publications to use their language, understand the nomenclature they're using internally that will help you communicate with them as a stakeholder. So a really important guidance document that was released in April of 2022 was diversity planning in clinical trials. And we can all agree collectively that controlling against bias and ensuring generalizability across your data sets for AI ML is critical and paramount to both FDA, but also post-market adoption, right? And as consultants, we engage with all OHTs across the FDA, specifically CDRH. And so in that, we get to see the trends that are emerging from how those interactions and how those review teams are implementing the various policies. And one of those trends is this guidance coming into fruition and FDA having a call to action for ensuring generalizability across your data sets. So in terms of what we're seeing with interacting with the FDA, Alex, what do companies need to be considering now if they aren't already?
So when you're collecting your data, you need to be considering the population that you're going to serve. And what you're going to find when you interact with FDA is they're going to ask you, for this population, is this going to work for all Americans? Which I think is a very important thing to be considering when you're starting your clinical study. It's not a great position to be in when FDA says your data set's just not representative of the US population after you've run your study. So it's really great to start early. Probably the other thing with generalizability is to realize it goes beyond just doing a power analysis to achieve your primary endpoint. You need to make sure that you're collecting enough data that you can demonstrate that your device actually generalizes to the US population. So that should also be kind of built into your pre-study considerations.
What are your thoughts, Rebecca?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other piece, as I mentioned before, though, is just making sure that you have enough of the disease state of interest. So it's important that it is representative of the US population and has enough positive incidence rates of the disease that you're looking at.
And one thing I'll add is some of the feedback we're seeing from the agency is seeing diversity in the types of clinical sites you're gathering your data from. So academic centers, community clinics, making sure that the diversity in not only the patient population, but the actual clinical site itself. So with that, I want to wrap with one question. What is one piece of advice you'd give to developers in the AI imaging or AI and ML space?
I would say is frequently engage with the FDA, talk to them, and they will collaborate with you to kind of chart a path forward.
Alex?
So, I mentioned earlier the FDA policy navigator for digital health. I would say, when you approach that, don't necessarily use wishful thinking for the answers, and really challenge yourself to figure out where you fit in. And I think that's just a really great place to start to figure out, if you're a regulated medical device or not.
So we've only skimmed the surface. There's a ton of digital health policy. The US FDA is really leading the global charge, and many global regulators are adopting the paradigms they're putting forth. So I encourage you all to see regulatory not as a barrier, but as a strategic business element to the success of your company. So thank you for your time. Awesome.